Welcome to Policy Talks. I am Etimofyong. Following the conclusion of the BRICS Summit here in Pretoria, South Africa, the international community now looks towards the G20 Summit holding in India later this week. At the conclusion of the BRICS Summit, 6 countries, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, were invited to join the group. Whether with the current BRICS or with an expanded BRICS, most of the countries are classified as part of the Global South. In this policy talk, we explore space cooperation within the Global South and India's role. Joining us to discuss this is Dr. Narayan Prasad. Dr. Prasad is the co-founder of Spaceport SARABHAI, the first space-focused think tank in India. He's also the Chief Operations Officer and co-founder of Satsearch, a virtual marketplace for the space industry. Dr. Prasad, thank you for joining us on Policy Talks.
Thank you so much for having me on here, Etienne. I look forward to our interaction.
Yeah, thank you. So when we were about to launch the African Space Leadership Institute, you were the first person in the subsector that I actually spoke with. And first, let me thank you for all the ideas and suggestions that you shared, and they've been very useful. So I'll start the interview actually from there. Think tanks, foundations are usually classified as civil society. So from your perspective and from your experience, what is the role or contribution of civil society to the development of space in a country?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because unlike a lot of the developed countries around the world, there are not many people in the global south who are also rich enough to fund the civil society to be independent, have an independent voice, right? So if you look at countries like the ones in Europe or US, you will find many think tanks like the Rand Corporation, or, there's so many of them that are around that are all funded by very wealthy individuals or families to basically advance the conversation independently in the civil society outside of the ambit of government having its own arms, or government funding academic institutes or so on, so that there is an independent voice that connects ideas that are coming out for the development of the country, to the policymakers at the end, right? And this is not a feature that you see a lot in the global south. Maybe an emerging feature because obviously today there's because many countries in the global south have been independent for the last 50-60 years. There's been at least now 1 or 2 generations of wealthy individuals who have come out of most of the countries, but then I'm not sure if they're very interested in space as such. So yeah. So I think we all in the global south in that sense struggle to have our voice heard if you are not representing yourself within the institutions that governments run, or the institutions that run typically like universities or so on. Then there is a lack of voice that is normally there present. So I think what you, I, and many other people in the global south in that sense are trying to do is really trying to create a platform for ourselves where we still remain independent, but in spirit are working towards the positivity, adding positivity to the dialogue and discourse of the society, and essentially trying to advance ideas of how space can be used as a tool in the advancement and the socio-economic development of our societies at the end. So obviously some of these ideas may be picked up by the policymakers who may be then interested in carrying it further on. But at the end, I think we are people who have some independence in terms of taking the risk of generating these ideas at the end and evangelizing these ideas so that policymakers consider it seriously.
Yeah, that's true. And I remember one of the things I also did was also to do kind of like a research in Europe and then the US to find out about think tanks and how they function. And actually, that's one of those things that gave me the motivation to co-found this with some other senior colleagues. One of the things that you do at S2 is oral history. You curate historical development of space in India by interviewing those who are in the sector. How do you think that effort also contributes to space development, especially maybe from the Indian perspective?
Yeah, it is extremely important to know where you come from, about the generations, because if you don't understand what is the struggle of your previous generations, you will not understand what privilege you have building on the back of people who have made the foundation for you, right? So I think as I go back, non-space again, most of the global south has achieved independence in the last 50 to 75 years to a large extent, or maybe 50 to 100 years. At the end, you take the African continent or the South American continent or the Indian subcontinent or many other places around the world, the majority of the countries have basically come out of colonialism and other things, in the last 75 to 100 years time frame to a large extent. But in that sense, there are two generations of people who have worked towards developing independent countries in the global south, in that sense, right? So when you look at it from that time frame, a country like India, who started doing space in the 60s, which is about 15 years after its independence, it's taken about 60 years of effort to develop a space economy of such, right? So which means that there are two generations of scientists and engineers who have worked to be able to develop the infrastructure, the human resources, the everything that exists in the country for the country to reach the moon after 60 years as at the end, right? So one of the things that most of the Western countries do very well is capture their history so that people are inspired by it, right? So you have the Apollo era, for example, of astronauts being interviewed and their perspective being taken, the mission engineers, the flight directors, the everybody involved in it. It's captured so very well, because I think even if you listen to it like 50 years from now, people will be inspired to see, oh, they put in so much effort to get that happen, right? But then we have those heroic figures also in the global south, right? You can go to any part of the world in the global south, I'm sure in many African countries, I'm sure in many of the Southeast Asian countries, or in places like India, where there are equally good heroic figures in the society who have tried and who have attempted, who have tried to contribute their own bit. But unfortunately, there is no platform or a voice for their contributions to be heard or to be captured or to be documented to a large extent. So I think one of the things that we realized in our think tank is that we need to create these and capture these voices, because a lot of them will fade away in the next 10 or 15 years at the end, right? Because a lot of these people are today in their 80s, some of them are in their 90s to a large extent, and they have worked 50, 60 years in the sector of space in a country like India to be able to help the country in terms of the infrastructure and the resources and manpower and all of these things, right? So, and I think it serves as a template for the future generations to empathize with how much work has gone into this sector, to be able to develop the opportunities for somebody to come up and do a satellite startup, or to do a launch vehicle startup, or do something else. It gives you this historical connection to your own people at the end, and that, I think, is a very, very important factor in using or having to appreciate your own culture and your own history and your own foundations to be able to build on top of it at the end. So we have enough in our own societies, in our own backyards, that we need to then appreciate before we look at all the other people around.
Yeah, and just the same idea, also the same rationale, maybe that's a better way. So we are also thinking of how to curate the efforts of those who have gone ahead. So we are redesigning our website, and Well, unfortunately, we can't do I mean, you do talks, you do podcasts, but so in this case, you're trying to do something like virtual libraries, which will be on the website. So people can put up the senior people, like senior professionals, put up their papers, their contributions. And so that's what we are working on right now. And hopefully the website will be ready very soon. Like you mentioned, some of the guys that you're interviewing, the folks are in their 80s and in their 90s. They laid the groundwork for India's successes in space, including the recent Chandrayaan-3 mission. I'm just wondering, what do you think? How do you think they'll be feeling? I mean, India being the fourth country to land on the moon, the first country to land on the south part of the south pole of the moon. How do you feel as a person, and then how do you think the people you have been talking to, those whom you've been interviewing, the elderly who laid the groundwork, what is the feeling like?
I mean, I think it's a great feeling because, at the end, I go back to, unfortunately, the non-space lens, which is coming from a historical perspective, because, India as a subcontinent has been under foreign rule and foreign occupation for several centuries now, right? And by the time India received its independence, our literacy rate was so low. I mean, we had like maybe 5% literacy among women and 7 or 8% among men, or something like that. And that's not so long ago. It's just 70 years ago at the end, right? And for a country of that nature to have built on its independence to reach to a level where its scientists and engineers are able to put a craft on the south side of the moon in a matter of 70 years, after 400 or 500 years of foreign occupation, in that sense, is an incredible thing for the society, right? At the end, to rejoice the true fruits of your freedom, where your people are able to express themselves scientifically and engineering wise, with art and many other things that actually go around with it, right? So I think the feeling was, in India we love cricket a lot as a sport, and when the cricket World Cup is running, there's easily like 300 million Indians watching the cricket match at the end, right? So it was almost like that at the end, where every train station, every television that was running, every mobile device that was running had the moon landing show being run on at the end. And it's a fascinating sign to see that people watch entertainment stuff generally at that level, but to have a scientific event being followed by such a large amount of people, right, is something that makes a country proud, because at the end, science and technology is what really builds economies over time at the end, right? And if you're able to create interest in science and technology in your population, at the end, that's when you are making an investment in progress in your overall economy at the end, right? So I think we have to look at it not from the lens of within our space community at the end, but the broader impact that this event has had on the entire 1.4 billion population of India, right? So I mean, many of those kids may be inspired to become scientists, astronauts, whatever, history folks, artistic people, just because they have something that they were inspired by looking at this event at the end. So, and then look at all the other ramifications. I mean, for something to fly to the South Pole and then to work, the reputation of Indian products around the globe, around the world, not because of space, may increase, because people may say, look, India is a country that has enough quality of products that even works on the moon, right? So we should probably trust some of the Indian products that are in the automotive sector, or other sectors as such, engineering sectors, because they have shown that some of the products that they even works on the moon at the end, right? So I think the broad effects of all of this and the soft power that India will get from having to have established something like that at a very small budget, there's many layers to how much benefit that there is at the end.
I'll come to the issue of the soft power very soon, but just like in many nations, and I'm sure India is included, there's always this talk of why put so much money in space when there are so many problems down here, hunger, diseases, flooding, and so many things. Do you think India has broken free from that challenge? Do you think the public now has a good interest in science, in space as a whole, or do you think there's still some more work to be done?
No, absolutely not, because I think the public is actually complaining that our space agency is not getting enough money, that they should be given more money to be able to do more things, actually. In fact, that's a very interesting topic as such, because the key difference is actually communicating the value to the society that is coming from space. I'll give you an example. About 30 years ago, maybe, India is very prone to flooding and heavy rainfall and, all of these things, right? Cyclones and things like that. And, about 30 years ago or so on, we had a massive cyclone in the eastern part of India where 10,000 people died because we did not have an early warning system as such. And, we did not have satellite capabilities that are able to do weather prediction and, help us prepare the ground for those communities to be rescued ahead of the disaster as such, right? And, today, not even 5 people are dying every year in India because of extreme cyclonic events and things like this, because our meteorological satellites are so good, and the use of data for meteorology in India has become so good that the early warning systems that are in place and the coordination that exists between the governmental entities that are involved in keeping communities safe are all very well tuned at the end. So today, even though cyclones exist, they still happen. The frequency of them sometimes are also increasing because of climate change and other things. But we have a robust enough system where 10,000 people are not dying because of all of these things. Hardly, not even 10 people are dying every year because of that reason, right? So what is the value of those 10,000 lives? Is it more than what is your space budget? Is it less than what is your space budget? What is the value of those lives for the people who have lost those people at the end? Is it more than your space budget? Is it less than your space budget? These are the questions I think we need to ask ourselves and ask our politicians and our people in the society at the end, right? So do people know that space can be used for such a cause? Probably not, but it's probably our job to inform them that maybe other countries have, and we should be using such a system in case we don't have such a system in that sense.
So it's quite interesting that possibly Israel's budget will be increased, but NASA's budget is being cut at this time. But anyway, that's not what I do want to focus on. Let's talk a bit about still on the moon mission. Just before the arrival of the Chandrayaan-3, Russia made an attempt at landing around the south side of the moon also. Do you sense some competition at play here?
No, I don't think so. There is any competition between these agencies or even those countries as such. Even if there are, I think the Indians don't really care about the competition, because I think, our programs were supposed to happen. They were supposed to happen for a long time. In fact, obviously, we made an attempt 4 years ago and it failed. And there was a second attempt to realizing that was supposed to happen in the roadmap at the end. So I think we don't have any evidence in any of the policy making or any of the budgetary allocations that are being done in our space program that indicates that there is any sort of competition with any sort of country over the last 50 years at the end. So in fact, our founding father of the Indian space program famously said in the 60s that India does not have the fascination of going after stuff that the Americans or others are doing with many of the things with the human landings in the moon and so on, but we are deeply looking at using satellites for the society for the benefit of the society. That has changed obviously a little bit because now we are going after the moon and Venus and other things. But I think that has to change because as your country evolves, you need to change your strategies in that sense as well. So so this is a feat of showing that this technology can be built in India and can be engineered and can be demonstrated for a country like India to be able to do it at the end, right? So at the moment, I think there's only two countries in that sense, with India and China in the developing world sphere, who are able to show that in that sense, right? So I think I hope that more and more countries from the global south invest into such programs and then are able to also do it. And I'm sure that there's, as we discussed already, there's lots of other spin-offs and benefits.
The roadmap in terms of space roadmap for India, I don't know that is publicly available. Is India planning a manned moon mission? Are you planning to extract resources from the moon or anything?
Oh,
What
no.
was the roadmap?
No, I mean, there is no such, I would say there is still not such an idea of having people on the moon and things like this. The plans of Indian space program are very clear and transparent and open for more or less everyone to see, because we have a very transparent budgetary allocation system happening for the civilian space program in the country. Because you can go to ISRO's own website, our space agency's website, or the website of the government, and they will tell you exactly how much money each of the entities and each of the programs are getting at the end. So there is no hiding any plans from anyone in that sense, right? Because the money being allocated to each program is visible to everyone around the world to then see. So obviously, we had the Aditya L1, which is the solar coronagraph mission that was launched immediately after the Chandrayaan 3 mission. Now, the next bit of missions are scheduled to be the human spaceflight demonstration missions, because so far, although India has the rocket, it was not fully human rated at the end. Now the human rating of the rocket is happening, and they will probably fly humanoid robots, basically, that can replicate human body, but with sensors, and are able to then launch it to have a sense of what happens to the human body while sitting on a rocket that is designed and made in India and human rated as such. Once they do the humanoid test, then they may do the full test with a couple of astronauts in there. And so that program is going to go forward in the next couple of years as such, to establish that we have the capability to also put up people up in low Earth orbit at the end. And beyond that, there are now new programs. So there is also now studies, I think, going on landing a rover on Mars, for example, because we did have a orbiter around Mars already, but we really gone to Mars on a landing mission as such. So we might be looking at that. They're also looking at a specific mission for the Venus, orbiting around the Venus and so on. So those missions, are always in place. But these are only missions that represent maybe 10% of the Indian space program, because these are one-off missions that happens once in a while at the end. But the focus is still largely a lot of the applications for people.
It's quite interesting. Let me pivot a bit to let's talk about the global south. Let's talk about space cooperation within the global south. Earlier on, I mentioned about the BRICS Summit that just concluded about 2 weeks ago, and 6 countries have been invited to join the BRICS. That makes it 11. We can actually view the BRICS, expanded BRICS, as kind of a representation of the global south. Do you see this expansion in terms of membership? Do you see it extending towards space? I mean, do you see an expansion in space cooperation within, first of all, within the BRICS itself, before we now even start extending to the global south?
The thing is, our Prime Minister actually did mention a sentence or two about having space as a part of the cooperation of BRICS. He actually proposed the idea that we should look at space as a angle, and maybe even look at having a set of satellites that service BRICS countries as such. But I know at the end, I think multilateral forums are not very effective for space, which has been shown, for many years now at the end, because there are too many different interests and too little focus on getting it through together. And, having the incentives to have everybody align is very difficult at the end. So I personally think that although there may be some interest in at the very early stages in BRICS, I think having a BRICS satellite seems a little bit far-fetched, to be very honest with you. But I think there is a low-hanging fruit for the BRICS countries who already have their own satellites to have data sharing agreements with other countries who are members at the end, and have an application-focused cooperation mechanism at the end. Because I think India, China, Russia, all of these countries operate a pretty large pool of satellites today at the end, and they can provide access to these satellites to the other BRICS countries that are in there. And the data that is coming from their satellites over the geography of the other members can be shared with them, and applications that are then going to be developed on top of that could be looked at to a large extent. So I think that is more realistic from the perspective of what can be achieved, at least in my opinion.
The BRICS Summit has been reported in the media in several forms. Some have been positive, some have been negative, some have been, especially the Western media, different reports. One of the issues that has been brought up is the issue of, like you mentioned, the issue of different interests. So which leads to maybe there won't be cohesion within the BRICS. Let's look at it maybe from the Artemis Accords, which the US is leading. If you look at the current BRICS now, Brazil and India are signatories to the Artemis Accords, but Russia and China have a separate partnership. South Africa's position is not yet very clear. And now we are now bringing in 6 new countries, which kind of complicates the matter. Some of them are signatories, some of them are not signatories. How would this affect space cooperation amongst the BRICS itself?
You mean the Artemis itself?
Yeah, I'm just trying to use the Artemis as an example. Yeah, so I'm not trying to, the question really is in terms of, like you mentioned, different interests, different priorities. And using the Artemis as an example, there are some BRICS countries that are in favor, that have signed the Artemis Accord. Some have not, some are indifferent. So really that's an example of, the lack of cohesion within the BRICS. So do you really see cooperation coming up? Because this will come out kind of extend to the global south as a whole.
Yeah, the thing is, I think there are 2 main anchor points that I look at it. At least from the perspective of India, I think Artemis is a non-binding instrument. It's not a treaty. It's not any of this. So it's a non-binding commitment to the accords in itself, and the spirit of the wordings that are written in there. Obviously, there are countries who are in favor of it, and countries that are not in favor of it. But does it change anything for ISRO? No, it's a political signature that has happened, but that does not mean that ISRO is getting to be on the Artemis mission unless India decides to also allocate a budget to be a part of the Artemis program at the end, right? There are many countries who have signed the Artemis Accord who don't even have a space program, probably, right? What does that really mean for them? They may be interested in the spirit of what the accords are saying, but if you don't have a program that contributes to the actual Artemis program and you're a signatory to the Artemis Accord, it's a ball of playing political alliances as such, rather than having to be a participant in the actual space program of the Artemis. So I think we should differentiate these 2 things very distinctly. Because even today, India, although is a signatory to the Artemis Accord, is not a part of the Artemis mission program at the end, unless the government in India, says that we will also be a part of the Artemis program. And here is whatever $100 million or $300 million, whatever the money is, that is allocated to our space agency, saying that you now negotiate an agreement with NASA or whoever it is, to see how India can also be a part of the Artemis program, and then contribute, I don't know, a satellite or a part of the lunar infrastructure or whatever it is at the end, right? So so that's a separate conversation altogether. So we don't see any movement in that with respect to being actually a part of the program at the end. And that's where I think the more interesting and exciting thing is that if you have money and you've invested in actually being a part of the program, and there's very little countries who have actually done that in that sense, right? So I think we should, at least for me, I think we shouldn't probably overread into what is going on with the accords in itself. I think what is really important to know is that if the policymakers are simply interested in signing the accord for the sake of alliances in between nations, or are they also interested in providing enough money for their national agencies and their industries locally to actually be a participant in the program.
Talking about the Artemis Accords, one of the articles in the Artemis Accords has to do with preservation of heritage sites. And I think somewhere in the media, I read about somebody from India who was proposing a name for the spot where the Indian rover landed. So what's your take on that?
It already happened, because the two places that India is with the crash site of the Chandrayaan-2 and the landing site of the Chandrayaan-3 have both been named by our Prime Minister already at the end. I don't see there is any point of not doing that, because at the end I think it's a big achievement as such, and there is nothing wrong in celebrating your achievement at the end by having a name that is culturally driven by your own people at the end, to celebrate that moment. I mean, there are international associations that name stars after people. At the end, there are places on the moon that are named after other people or other places or so on, right? And there are planetary bodies as well in that sense that are there. So I don't think there is any way, but I think it also, I think boosts this involvement of your own population for the space program by doing so to a large extent, right? So and it's in the spirit of celebrating your achievements to a large extent. So I don't see that as anything wrong. In fact, I think every country should be able to do that to a large extent, because that's one way of engaging your public to a large extent. And our Prime Minister also declared the day of the landing to be the National Space Day in India, right? So I'm not really sure that there is any other country that also has a National Space Day at the end. But I think it's a great outreach effort by directly our Prime Minister, right? Because at the end, he has now created a day in the calendar of the year where our space scientists and engineers will be celebrated across the country at the end. And in India, you have all kinds of days. You have Teachers' Day, obviously. You have the Father's Day, you have Mother's Day, and all of these other things, right? And I think it's a great way of saying that this is celebrating our achievements in space. Having the National Space Day on the landing, on the successful landing on the south side of the moon, is a great way of celebrating our scientists and engineers, right? So, and having the public engage there. I'm sure that once the next year comes around, there will be schools, universities that are all going to be holding competitions and quizzes and many other events that are there, hackathons and so on, that are around space theme, because it's a National Space Day at the end. And that's one way of really propagating that we need to be able to not only do more things in space, but also getting your own community and people involved to realize that, yeah, we have to do more things, being a part of the space community.
Let's touch briefly on the forthcoming G20 summit. What are your expectations from the summit, especially as regards to space cooperation?
To be very honest with you, not much, I would say, because I personally don't really, see, because, there is also a lot of still conflict between the BRICS members or even the G20 members as such, who are also part of the BRICS or the G20 at the end. I think there's still too many barriers in politics at the end for space to find itself as an olive branch within those people, right? So, I mean, it's the same with many other things. You already have, APRSAF, you have the Asia Pacific region, the APSC, the one that are led by the Chinese, and you have SARC in the region of India and so on. All of them have some angle of space to it at the end, but nothing seemed to have worked in a way that it's taken on giving full advantage to the countries who are already members to that. You probably can say something similar about the African space effort as a part of the African Union as such. Probably, I don't know how much of that has already impacted each of the countries in terms of the benefits of being a. So I think multilateral space efforts, bilateral is much more obviously easier because you're talking country to country at the end. But I think multilateral, especially when there are more than 5 countries in there who all have their different interests and so on, it just becomes too much to realize something that in a time frame that is doable, in a way that it is practical to pass on the benefits of that to the societies of each of the countries, right? So I think it's much better to have bilateral cooperation, which India already has with many other countries who are a part of the G20 or so on. And I think India has that with probably around 80 countries or so on, some sort of bilateral arrangement that involves space as such. So I think for me, I don't see that G20 is a great forum for space as such. I think bilateral mechanisms far outweigh the advantages for cooperation at the end, and for practical implementation of programs for the benefit of the societies, of each of the societies, rather than these. I mean, look at India and France. I mean, we've developed space engines together. We've done satellites together. And now the French are also helping India with respect to the Venus mission, or we have cooperation going on with the thermal infrared satellite. We have, the cooperation on the human space flights. So the bilateral relationship that India has with France, which is also a part of the G20, far exceeds, India doing anything with France as a part of the G20.
Interestingly, the African Union has been invited to the summit and probably will be invited to join the G20 formally. Well, there's some excitement within the African Union, within Africa, in the sense that, they've been talking about reforming multilateral institutions like the UN. But I don't know, do you think the idea is for the African Union's voice to be heard? And usually, at least for our own area of interest, we look at in terms of space governance. So if the AU is brought into the G20, will this change global space governance in any way?
I mean, you mean like the African Union as a part of the G20?
Yeah, that's the plan. The plan is they've been invited to the G20, and the idea is actually to make them formally a member of the G20. And of course, the African Union is representing about 55 countries. So do you think in the discussions there, does it change space governance, global space governance in any way?
I mean, I personally don't think so. To a large extent, I might be wrong. I don't know, but from my way of looking at some of these alliances and groupings in multilateral mechanisms, I think space, firstly, among policymakers, there is very little knowledge of space at the end. even in the most developed Western countries around the world. For example, if you go to the German chancellor, I am not really sure how much of space related sector knowledge he would have, as of a considering even our prime minister, for example, who probably knows a lot about ISRO because he oversees a lot of the effort directly as the minister in charge for our space program at the end, right? So I think unless there are in the pecking order were very important things to be discussed in a multilateral forum of the nature of the G20. Space is at the very bottom, at the end of discussion in that sense, right? So yeah, I mean, and also I think it's a question of what do countries want to get out of such a discussion, because at the end space is still deeply involved with national security, sovereign capabilities, and many other aspects, right? So it's not going to be like a discussion on climate change or a discussion on economy where you have people who are escaping the tax system and all the countries want to work together to be able to capture them, and many other complicated topics that actually involve each country equally, regardless of their interest. But when it comes to space as a sector, we have to know that space is still very deeply involved with security as well as sovereign capabilities that each country has, which probably each of the countries don't want to share with other countries. And they might want to share the applications that are possible with it, but not the technology that goes into it at the end, right? So I think that also makes it very complicated for any of these forums to really work, because there is no arrangement between any country of such in any multilateral forum that they would say that I will share launch vehicle technology with you at the end, right? Or I will share with you the most advanced satellite making IP, such. So they may tell you that, oh, I am happy to share some of the imagery for your country when my satellites go up on your country. And if you have a ground segment or a station that you can download data for, I'm happy to coordinate that among my satellite, right? So I think those are realities that still are a part of the space sector, which will not go away at the end. And that is why countries may not really be interested of upstream space cooperation, which involves either launching of rockets or launching of satellites. But the focus, I think, if it is on position navigation and timing related applications, or weather, or agriculture, or so on, and the data sharing arrangements, those are maybe much more realistic for these things rather than the others, because it's just sovereign interests don't allow these multilateral forums perhaps to even bring that to a discussion.
Let's look at India and the African Union, just like China, Japan, the EU, the US. India has a formal relationship with the African Union, and I know they meet from time to time in form of summits. When it comes to space cooperation between the two regions, what's your thoughts? What's your assessment of space cooperation between India and the African Union?
I think there is a lot of possibilities for sure. But I think for me personally, the biggest possibility is replicating a lot of the new things that India is doing with using space as a part of advancing the society to be replicated in the African region. I will give you an example that is concrete. India has about 125 million farm families that are dependent on farming still. About 50% of India's GDP still is linked to agriculture to a large extent. So for many, many decades now, even after independence, we've not had the ability to digitize our farmland as a country. We don't know where what is being grown, who is growing it, how much of it is being grown, and all of these other things, right? So we've not been able to digitize our irrigation system, digitize our land system, digitize the crop distribution, the crop yield, link it with stuff like climate change and so on. So that's not happened for a long time, but now we are doing it. We have companies that are helping the government execute on this. And what is the advantage now? You have the ability to finance farmers based on the knowledge that you're creating of this digitization effort. You can link that to insurance companies in case crop fails. You can link that to companies who are selling farm equipment, seeds, fertilizers, and all of these things. You can link it to the market, because you can say that please don't overproduce rice over something else, or depending on the conditions of the soil and depending on the conditions of irrigation, you can provide advice saying that instead of growing rice, please grow something else, and you will have a much more better yield here than if you grew rice, because you've been growing rice for 10 generations in that place, right? So I think data driven farming and data driven economics around agriculture is picking up to a large extent because of space. In a country like India, it's going to have an impact on 125 million farm families at the end, right? And imagine if something like that is also replicated in Africa. How many African farmers are able to go to a bank and get a loan based on their farm? And how many of those banks have actual risk mitigation measurements, or risk mitigation possibilities based on such an application by a farmer at the end, right? So I think we have very close knit of problems which are similar in both the African continent and the Indian continent, right? So, and if we in India are able to make use of some piece of technology to be able to benefit that community at the end, I don't see why that cannot be replicated by somebody in Africa as well, right? So it's, the technology base can come from India, but for implementation, you need to know the people, the culture, the language, and many other things at the end, right? So that's where we can really partner, because we can bring some elements of the technology, but the real implementation on the ground, which is 80% of the work, needs to happen by a local partner who is going to evangelize the solution, who is going to take the solution, who's going to implement it, who is going to execute it, and do everything around it, right? So there are many such examples. Like there's a company in India that has vertically integrated aquaculture that uses satellite imagery. So they now have, they go down to having aquaculture with all kinds of seafood, and use satellite imagery to monitor the health of those things, and also have stores at the end there where they go sell that as well. So it's a really vertically integrated solution from farm to fork that uses space and AI together at the same time, right? So imagine doing that in places like in whatever, Nigeria, and the entire coast of the African continent at the end. The technology stacks is available at the end. The only thing that you have to change is the geography, the language, the people, the application at the end. And the price points will be similar, right? Because if an an Indian farmer is able to get a service at a certain price, the price points will always be similar to what somebody in South Africa or Kenya or Nigeria or any other place as such will also then be able to afford, because it's a south to south problem.
Yeah.
Right. You're not bringing a solution from Western Europe or US where somebody is paying 1,000 times more for a particular solution, and it becomes unaffordable if you bring that to any part of the global south. Right. So I think we have to identify such things where communities will advance at the end, and agriculture may be the best starting point for all of us in that sense, because in the global south, still 50% of our people still heavily depend on agriculture, and modernizing agriculture using space and other tools will bring already these 50% of the people forward.
Let me take you back to one of the comments you made earlier. That's that multilateral cooperation or institutions are not very effective. So look at India, African Union. African Union is 55 countries. Well, what do you think? Is it more effective for India to deal with the African Union, or for India to deal with the individual countries of the African Union?
I think, it really depends on what is being discussed as a topic. If it is, for example, let's have access to satellite data, only satellite data, right? It could be the African Union, where we might say, oh, like, the satellites are going up on Egypt, so we will give you data for Egypt. Satellites are now going from Egypt to Nigeria. Let's go give you the data on Nigeria. From now, the satellites are going from Nigeria to Uganda. You give you satellites data. So there is no conflict of interest there, because obviously when a satellite is up on Egypt, it's not up on Nigeria at the end. It's giving you data for Egypt, right? So, but then that may not translate to as a benefit to the society, because you are making some information available, but it's not action that is delivered to the society. The action is then left to the person in Egypt to be able to then. So is there an incentive for that person to then do it? Or the policy makers say that, oh, we've had to do cooperation with India. It's great that we clap hands and we now have an agreement to get this data, but it's sitting in our backyard and nobody in our country is using any of this data. We just have an agreement with India to have this data. So, it's really at that level, how much of that is turning into action for the society as such. So I think we need to reinvent how we cooperate in the global south as such. I think the reinvention can only happen when our stakeholders in the bottom of the pyramid, the farmers, the fishermen, the people building, monitoring natural resources, our minerals and metals and everything else, they are directly connected to space as a part of the cooperation. If we establish a chain of command where an average farmer, in Kenya is benefiting from a satellite from India or China or Russia or wherever it is, and is able to have a change in his lifestyle by either being more productive or getting more crop yield or having access to credit or having access to insurance or any other part of his life at the end, if that becomes the framework of cooperation, where the benefit is really passed on to the end user, then it's a question of it can be multilateral, it can be bilateral. At the end, it doesn't really matter at the end. But if the cooperation is simply for countries to establish friendly relationships and not pass on the actual benefit to the society, for policymakers to be friendly with each other and not for the people to get the people to people relationship going on, that's when the problem is not really solved at the end, right? So the problem still exists, and you've done some high level cooperation where nobody cares on the ground. There is no impact on the ground at the end, right? So I think this is what I see as something that we as a part of civil society should probably push for. I mean, we as think tanks could also be looking at it. We say that, I mean, we don't care about simply data sharing agreements. We want direct benefiting programs that connect our banks with our farmers, our fishermen with technology that is in their smartphones that can help them do better fishing. So we need to be able to advance cooperation at the service level, not at the infrastructure level at the end, for immediate benefit to be passed on.
That's really quite instructive. As in, if I may rephrase, and that's to have a two-tier approach towards space cooperation at a higher level with the African Union, maybe at the infrastructure level, and then a second tier where we now focus on services and trying to reach to those who actually, the locals, those who actually need the services. As we round up, I just want to touch a bit on your work at Satsearch. Very interesting. But I want to look at it from the African perspective. Most of the companies in Africa that develop components, subsystems, or systems most times they export it to foreign countries, maybe in Asia or Europe. From your work at Satsearch and from your research analysis, what's your assessment of Africa's contribution to the global satellite value chain?
Yeah, there's two kinds actually, because we've actually worked with a number of African countries in helping them procure for their missions. I think the biggest user that we have in Africa from a perspective of the space program is Egypt, because I think almost on a every day or in every week basis, we work with the Egyptian engineers for their program that they are building at the end. We've also had engineers from South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, among other countries, use us as a part of the small programs that they may be building as a part of the countries as such. Some of them CubeSats, some of them bigger satellites as such. And so there's our work is split into two. One is really helping engineers in Africa to be able to source components and services to be able to build their programs up. And the other bit is really if there are African companies who are able to sell equipment around the world, using us as a channel to reach out to potential customers at the end. And for that, I think at the moment, the only African country where we see a lot of commercial space equipment selling happening is in South Africa at the moment, because they have a hub of a few companies, a handful of these companies like NewSpace Systems, CubeSpace, Dragonfly Aerospace, Simera Sense, and CubeCom, and a couple of others who have built up the competence based on the program in Stellenbosch and other such programs from Sunsat and others that Africa has made an investment in the last 30 or 40 years to be able to have an industry that is able to export. But in their case, I think 99% of their products are being exported outside of Africa as such. And there's not really so much of an internal market yet for them to have equipment being sold to other satellite systems within as such. So those are the two ways in which we've been working with most of the countries.
ITAR has been in the news of late. I mean, the US ITAR regulations, as you're aware, SpaceX was recently charged by the Department of Justice for violating ITAR rules. In your business, how does ITAR affect what you do? How does ITAR affect the global satellite value chain?
Yeah, I mean, ITAR is a problem only if you want to, buy US equipment, because at the end of the day, ITAR is a US phenomena of the American government controlling the export of technologies to other countries as such. But I think ITAR in the process has also created a market outside of the US, because today, if you look at many of the European countries or Japan or or even India as such, a lot of the companies pride on themselves as this is a non-ITAR free, it's an ITAR free product, is what they market themselves as at the end. So ITAR is reaching a level where the American companies are losing market share around the world because the government is not fast enough in removing certain items from the ITAR ambit, right? So the pace of innovation of the reforms are not fast enough to be able to match up to the market development in other countries around the world, which means that today a lot of the companies outside of the US are able to sell ITAR free equipment to other countries, and the US is actually losing out on a lot of that business as such. So obviously, for missiles and controlled technologies as such in space, it makes sense to then have it. But there is a very obvious role for policymakers in the US to review and reform ITAR at the end, and then that only is now hurting a lot of their businesses as such. as technology is becoming more and more available in places like China, India, and other places, in Japan, in Europe, and so on. So where similar products that are non-export controlled are now being made available for export as such, right? It's a question of are you able to find them? Are you able to get access to that? And that involves a little bit of supply chain work, intelligence. But I think I don't see this as a hassle from 20 years on. Like, 20 years on, if you want to get a sensor, America might have been the only place who had a supplier to be able to give you that sensor at the end. But 20 years on now, I'm pretty sure that you can find an alternative in a lot of places at the end. So ITAR is only going to become more and more weaker, especially for space, is at least my thought process.
Okay, let me conclude by going back to where we started from, and that's back to S2, Spaceport SARABHAI. And my final question is, what should we expect from, what are your plans in the next, in the short term, mid-term, not only for India, but maybe by extension to the global south?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I think we are looking at creating a structure for the think tank in a way in which we can also host researchers that are independent as such. So one of the things that we have now is a thought process that we might go raise kind of endowment funds with wealthy families in India who are able to support the think tank to have people who are going to be doing PhDs in universities, who are going to be having topics that are related to space as such, not from a technology standpoint, but from a social science standpoint, from an economic standpoint, or from a historical standpoint, or an artistic standpoint. At the end, I think we have enough people doing engineering related work in a country like India. We need people doing social sciences work that are related to space. How many fishermen in India benefit from space? How do they benefit from it? What impact does it have on their routine by using something that is space related technology? How much of productivity is being created in their lives because they used some satellite data that is on their phone as such? So these are fascinating questions that you need somebody to commit time and effort for. And it's going to only advance the case for space in a developing country at the end. So, I mean, if India is investing 1 rupee into space, how much of that is creating an impact on our economy? What is the impact of that 1 rupee of investment on our overall GDP? Is that 1 rupee translating to 15 rupees, or is it 1 rupee translating into 20 or 50, whatever? We don't know. We don't have, our space agency mostly employs engineers and scientists. It does not employ economists and artists and historians and social scientists at the end, right? So and so we need to, as a part of the civil society, encourage these people who have competencies in these other sectors to look at space and look at what is the impact that we are having on the sector, right? So and so for that, we unfortunately we cannot change the way our space agency works as such in the short term. It's a cultural difference, but what we can do is do that ourselves at the end. And so that's the step that we probably are going to take, which is very surgically look at which areas we want to have competencies built in. We want to create a independent space focused management research group, for example, where you will have a team of economists work with social scientists and so on, where they may have some people who understand space technology, but they will bring their angles around macroeconomics, microeconomics, around impact on the society, frameworks of how do you measure all of that. So these are all things that can provide new information to our policymakers and our politicians as to why they need to be also investing even more in space at the end, because that way we can prove it to them scientifically that we have done research, and anybody can criticize this if they want to, that we should be investing even more in all of this, and we are creating an impact on all of this. Unfortunately, I don't see many of the countries in the other parts of the global south taking any such approach. As such, it often happens to be a club of space geeks who are often running around trying to build satellites and so on, but not really people outside of the space bubble who are then brought into the space sector to then create the value as such, right? So the difficulty in doing things, being a part of the global south, is that we cannot replicate models that are in the US. We are not America, we are not Europe at the end, we are India at the end, right? So you need to accept what you are, and stop looking at we might take some inspiration from other countries, but I think we cannot follow what they have. We don't have the kind of money that they have. We don't kind of have kind of resources that they have. We have to play to what we have as strengths at the end, and look at ourselves more internally than externally is the thing, right? So this is what we believe it will help us, and this is the step that we are going to take as such. And if it works out, it works out, because at least we've made the effort of trying at the end. And if we succeed, I think it's going to be a path that many other countries can follow. They can use our frameworks, because we're going to open source the frameworks. We can look at creating all of this knowledge and putting it out there, and after that many other countries may simply use the framework.
Just to put it, my final question is, do you see your work, your efforts going beyond India, maybe to the global south?
Look, at the end, we are a very small group yet. I hope it does.
Maybe in future?
If maybe in a few years, I don't know at the end, but I think at the moment we are still very much focused on only our country as such. It's a big country. We represent 1 in 7 people. So I think, I hope, we are able to, but as I said, I think in some of these cases, we might create the knowledge infrastructure that can be used by, like people like you, for example, might simply say that we can use the same infrastructure around computing numbers, when it comes to the benefit to the economy or other things. Or we might have, we could even organize side events where, if we're having a space conference, we might want to have partner countries that are from Africa, where we might want to invite banks, insurance companies from Africa to look at what space technology Indian companies are able to create for banks in India that can be used by banks in Africa to a large extent. So I think I don't see us as somebody who will engage with space agencies directly or so on. I unfortunately don't see a lot of that translating into action for the society, because I think space agencies still ask for a lot of money to build satellites and rockets and things like this, and very little space agencies around the world in the global south actually care about creating an impact for the society as such. So I think there is much more utility in the global south to talk to people outside of the space bubble as such, and to have people work with terrestrial industries, have banks create risk infrastructure for farmers, to have telecom companies have apps for fishermen, to have airline industries to have access to internet up in air, have shipping industries have access to all kinds of other things. So I think because there is a direct incentive for them to engage, because they are going to make money out of it at the end by providing a service at the end. So it's going to be a benefit that is going to be passed on to the end user, and in the process the stakeholder is going to actually have business which is sustainable for them. It's not going to be a grant where today a politician is around and tomorrow there's somebody else who doesn't like space and is going to cut the money off at the end. So it's going to be sustainable only in this fashion, because everybody in the process is being productive and everybody in the process is actually making money.
Dr. Prasad, we have to stop at this point. We've actually overshot our time. And so I really want to thank you for the points, for your thoughts, and we look forward to having you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Edu.